Thank you so much to Abolition Is for having me. Tonight I'm going to perform a poem. It's called Radical Imagination. And I wrote this poem originally as a commission for an organization called Densho, which seeks to preserve, educate, and share stories about the World War II Japanese American concentration camps. And I write these remarks during a time of increased anti-Asian violence and about a month after a shooting in Atlanta in which a white man murdered 8 people, massage parlor workers, 6 of whom were Asian women. So before I read the poem, I wanted to speak a little bit about that violence and how we can find solutions in abolition, and also about my own ancestors, who I felt with me as I was writing the poem and who I felt carrying me forward during this moment. My family were incarcerated in Japanese American internment camps. My great-grandmother was 20 years old at the time of her imprisonment, and she later went on to become a civil rights revolutionary. Her name was Yuri Kochiyama. She was incarcerated with her siblings and her mother, and her father's life was taken by FBI agents. On December 7th, 1941, hours after Japanese soldiers bombed Pearl Harbor, Yuri's father was forcibly taken from his home by agents on suspicion of being a Japanese spy after having just returned from the hospital for ulcer surgery. He was interrogated and presumably tortured for weeks, and when he was returned to my family, he had been denied his medicine for the entire duration of the interrogation, so he could not speak or recollect who any of them were, and he died the next day. Systems of incarceration, punishment, and policing are foundationally rooted in racism. My family became aware of this when they were profiled, displaced, and imprisoned by the US government, and generations prior, on my father's other side of the family, my ancestors were captured and sold into chattel slavery. Like many of us, my lineage and the history of my family's existence in America has been bound up in struggle against captivity and carceral punishment. In the wake of the killings in Atlanta and violence against Asians during the pandemic, many people are calling for increased policing in Asian neighborhoods and for hate crime legislation. They're calling on the state to protect and defend their people and to recognize this violence as racism. And yet, the women who were murdered were amongst groups of people most targeted, criminalized, and violated by the police. They were low-wage, migrant, perhaps undocumented women, and they were massage parlor workers and potentially sex workers, 2 types of laborers that are intersected and penalized for their association with one another. These women were likely survivors of police violence, as massage parlor workers and sex workers often are, and yet these nuances of their experiences, of their intersectionality, get erased in the conflation of all anti-Asian violence, and they are rendered irrelevant, even when people name law enforcement, the most prominent and empowered perpetrators of violence against these women, as the solution to the problem. As Dr. Connie One, a brilliant abolitionist, puts it, when you conflate and decide to name solutions for the most vulnerable, you leave them susceptible to violence that you didn't consider. We cannot seek protection against racist violence from a state that refuses to implicate itself in the creation of that violence. It is crucial that we look to a history of US imperialism and wars in countries like Korea, Vietnam, and the Philippines as a legacy of racist and misogynistic violence against Asian people. So when we point the finger at one another, when we center interpersonal violence, when we look to define the violence as individualized acts of hate, we ignore the actual and active cause of our oppression. But if we do name the state as the actual and active cause of our oppression, then we must accept that we cannot work with it, reform it, or ask it for help. We have to find alternatives. And the beautiful thing is that the alternatives already exist. They are already enacted, enabled, documented, shared, and prepared to direct us. The alternatives are abolition. Ruth Wilson has said abolition is not just the absence of a thing, not just the tearing down of a thing, but the building of something new and transformative. We already know that building transformative futures requires great imagination, but what I've come to love most about looking forwards is that there are blueprints for dreaming available to us whenever we look back. What critics and skeptics who react fearfully to the idea of abolition aren't recognizing is that alternatives for protection, health, and caretaking have existed in communities of color in the United States since their inceptions. I opened this poem with a quote from Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is a political prisoner and abolition activist. Mumia was a dear friend of my grandma Yeri. She began their relationship by writing to him in prison, and they maintained contact until she died a few years ago. And Mumia was one amongst thousands of incarcerated activists that Yuri wrote to every single day of her life. Correspondence, letter writing, that was their way of fighting the carceral system through sustained communication and community building. The letters, and again, this woman wrote thousands upon thousands of letters, disseminating information from the outside in and vice versa, sending books and newspapers, passing along the names of other prisoners who needed channels of aid. These were all acts intended to sustain the lives, dignity, and health of those incarcerated, to remind them that they were never forgotten or discarded, that even inside the darkest, loneliest, most evil constructions of the criminal industrial complex, struggle and hope persisted. And correspondence wasn't Yuri's only alternative method of care. She also embodied the concept of mutual aid by opening her home to anyone, literally anyone who needed shelter and food, a place to hide or a place to sleep or a place to organize. When there were no more beds, she slept in the bathtub or in the crib with the baby. Every Saturday night, she and her husband Bill opened their home for a gathering of everyone imaginable. Activists, artists, teachers, entertainers, whomever, and everyone was welcome. And this was Harlem in the 60s, in a housing project on 126th Street, an apartment that could not house the amount of folks that passed through it, but did, and the door was always open, no matter what. They created the conditions for safety and mutual trust and exchange, and I think about that, and it seems almost remarkable to me. How the work of her life was building communities that were accountable to one another, in which everyone had a person and a place to go for help. I see many connections between the practices of racial solidarity and abolition, particularly in the ways that people perceive these practices, react to them, and regard them with weariness and distrust. Some people hear the word abolition and decide it can't or doesn't exist. They cannot envision or imagine the possibilities it suggests. They don't see the long lineage of abolition and application that is as old as the systems it challenges. And people hear the word solidarity and decide that it cannot exist, that it is a myth, a false promise, or an optimistic delusion. When we are conditioned to maintain divisions between one another, we often fail to understand that alliances between communities of color are and have been as real, frequent, and continuous as conflicts between them. As a person who is both Black and Asian, I see instances of racist interpersonal violence between Black and Asian people be upheld, centered, and pointed at in so many narratives about our communities. It is far more rare to hear the true and persistent stories of solidarity between people, coalitional solidarity that enabled movements, but not because these events are less critical or less worthy of being documented. The myth that our communities are inherently incapable of working together, as well as the myth of our need for oppressive systems, only serve and protect a state that wants to keep us complacent and sick. So, When people regard abolition or solidarity as futurist fantasies that are impossible to realize, I think about all the ways these alternatives of care and justice and love have already been initiated. As organizers, the act of dreaming and the daring to do so is our radical inheritance. We inherit the dreams of those who worked and struggled before us and expand on them and continue them. Acknowledging the ancestry of those dreams helps us reinforce our belief that they are not only achievable, but pragmatic, real, and realized. The dreams I inherited are not limited by immobility or lies about what we can't change. They are full of tools and lessons. I take comfort in knowing that these dreams are not fallacies or unchecked fantasies, but imagined realities that are as true as the daily functions and interactions of our communities who have been denied and invisibilized for so long and persisted still. I'll tell one more story about Yuri. In 1964, Malcolm X visited Yuri at her home in Harlem. She was hosting survivors of the Hiroshima bombing, but when people heard Malcolm might be in attendance, the whole neighborhood came out to hear him. When Malcolm spoke to the survivors, he drew a connection. He said, "You were bombed and are physically scarred. We too were bombed, and you saw some of the scars in our neighborhood. We are constantly hit by the bombs of racism." And then he made a pronouncement that was prophetic. This was before the U.S. incursion into Southeast Asia, and he warned them. He said, "If America sends troops to Vietnam, you should protest. The struggle of the Vietnamese is the struggle of the whole third world. The struggle against colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism." And Yuri would later point to Harlem's early participation in the anti-war movement and attribute that to Malcolm's vision. When I am told stories about Malcolm and Yuri, I think about how their friendship was contingent upon a shared vision of the future that was viable for all people scarred by racism. And when I was writing the poem, I asked myself what a future like that would look like. And for a long time, I couldn't get past the first stanza because I was trying to envision something in my mind's eye that just looked blurry and unclear. And then one day I asked my ancestors the same question. What does this future look like? And they started to speak, whispering in my ear, instructing me on what to say to the people who come next. The words that finally arrived are constructions of their dreams and mind. The poem is called Radical Imagination. Conventional wisdom would have one believe that it is insane to resist this, the mightiest of empires. But what history really shows us is that today's empire is tomorrow's ashes, that nothing lasts forever. In this, our new country, I gather my children, say, how lucky you are to grow up out of ashes. We have buried all the emperors for you to play with your cousins on the grass their bodies give, the only thing they had to offer the earth in the end. For you to run free through prairies, hills, forests, and fields that belong to none of us. Because in this country, we sidestepped the grave error of etching our names onto everything with its own language. This time, we let the land break our tongues over its own pronunciation. This time, the land tells us how we can be of use, and we train our ears to receive. And that was just the first decree. In this, our new country, where it is not a crime to come from somewhere else, and citizenship is granted upon reenactment of one's most beloved proverb, since every other is part of one, another blended harmony standing out in a national anthem, and you can be a bended knee. or raised fist or palm over heart, since in this country, we mind our own business, don't tell nobody how to move against the swell of song. In the old empire, they labeled us poison while letting the life out of water. Isolated us like illness in the body they drew us into, a body they invaded first and claimed to have came to consciousness inside. They constellated the land with confinements, cut fences and clamped circles around whole demographics, from the knowingest grandmother to the freshest son, who never got the chance to be both alive and young enough not to be hated by his country. They shut us into camps, concentrated their eyes on our entire lives, registered our birthdays. They took fishermen for spies, then handed them back to our families broken into scales. They swiped our language and left only bare skeletons of folk tales. They closed us into prisons, while plantations stayed open for white people to throw weddings on. They closed in at the protest and beat us open over and over, as if to beat their obsession, blood taste for blackness out as many bodies as their batons could touch. And I know, it may be irresponsible to use the word we. Presumptuous pronoun us in a poem, but this is a country, and we made us a possibility, an even plain, a wilderness of differences with the same height, the same healthcare, the same rights, the same blood, the same children, and I am an us, a mixture of countries and blood that met as comrades and created the same children. My ancestors come to my candle, whisper. We suffered different beneath the same rule, but our resistances rub shoulders, and the shared muscle is you. They told me that, so I could tell you, my children. We have burned it all down for you. There are no prisons, only gardens, no wardens, only women with an eye on your progress as you make it home late at night. There are no cops, just your girls running up to form a chain, just witches twitching to twist up a perp's name with their tongues. There are no reservations, only free feast programs running from coast to coast, no cages, only open bars for boarders to mingle with hosts. We have every reason to toast the grand old guardsmen of convention, because they were so wrong. We, the natives, survived the end they promised would never come, and we marched on. At some point, with our backs turned, the past entombed itself in glass, renamed itself history. We thought the war on us would always last, but here you are, blessed progeny of protest, anointed with ash, uprising every dawn.